everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, August 14th, 2023, and I'm the host of the show, Cara Santa Maria. And as always, before we dive into this week's episode, which I think is a really, really important one and also a very timely one, I do want to spend some time with some business right here at the top. First and foremost, I wanted to let you guys know a little bit about what's going on with me. Sometimes I sneak updates into the conversations, but we also sometimes record the episodes at different times from when they air. So these intros I always record, just a day or two before. And I wanted to let you know that today, Monday the 14th, I am defending my doctoral dissertation. So wish me luck, although if you're listening to this, it's probably already happened. The title of that, if you're interested, is My Decision, My Way Out, My Time, an existential hermeneutic phenomenological inquiry into the psychological experience of medical aid in dying. I hadn't actually until right this second thought about perhaps doing an episode to discuss this. Maybe we could do that. Maybe when I'm at QED in a few weeks in Manchester. I know I'm going to be recording some episodes there. So there will be new stuff coming. I've got a nice long list of incredible authors and scientists and just all around interesting people that I have the opportunity to interview. So we've got a great slate of episodes coming for you. But yeah, today's a big one for me. And then, barring, any unforeseen circumstances, on August 31st, which is the last day of my internship as a psychology trainee, or I guess a psychology intern, then I will finish my PhD officially. And you can call me doctor. Don't worry, I won't be obnoxious. Maybe the first episode I'll be like, this is Dr. Cara Santa Maria, but I won't do that too much. But yeah, thank you all for your support throughout all of this time and your interest, and all of your nice, amazing, supportive comments on social media have just really kept me going. It's been not the easiest past year, and so I just really appreciate it all. But honestly, enough about me, because this is a really, really important episode. So today is the 14th. Tomorrow, the 15th, is the anniversary of basically, how would I put it? The Taliban taking back over in Afghanistan. I guess the Taliban takeover would be the best way to put it. At least that's how PBS is wording it. That's 2 years now since the siege of the Afghan capital of Kabul. And so we have an incredible conversation for you today with Sola Mahfouz and Malaina Kapoor. So Sola was born in Kandahar, Afghanistan in 1996, which is the year that the Taliban took over for the first time. She experienced from the time she was born the impossibility of a closed society where women's rights essentially didn't exist. She was not able to be educated. She saw the women around her, including her mother, wearing all-concealing burqas. And then she was able then to attend school after, of course, the American military moved in. But again, at age 11, she was forced to stop attending school after a group of men threatened to throw acid in her face if she continued. She was confined to her home. She had to cook, clean, prepare for an arranged marriage. And her story sadly was not unique. But Sola then decided that she would educate herself, that she would work tirelessly to learn what she could, utilizing the resources that she could piece together, and ultimately was able to basically escape, to sneak into Pakistan and take the SAT so that she could then get placed in placed is not even a good word, but so that she could get the opportunities that were required to study in the United States. Not an easy road, but ultimately she did in 2016. She immigrated to the U.S. to attend college, and she's currently a quantum computing researcher at Tufts University Quantum Information Group. She's also a writer, and she studies different styles of fiction and enjoys writing about the home that she left behind. Her co-author, Malaina Kapoor, who is a dear friend, is also a writer who served as a fellow at PEN America, who has advocated for international human rights, press freedoms, and election integrity. She also produced In Deep, a nationally syndicated public affairs radio broadcast program, and she has won awards for her poetry, her essays, and her short stories. All that, and she is still working on her undergraduate degree. She's wow, these women are just so accomplished, so young and so accomplished, working on her undergraduate degree at Stanford. So enough from me. I think it's very, very important that you hear Sola's story. So without any further ado, I'm honored to have had the opportunity to chat with both Sola Mahfouz and Malaina Kapoor, the authors of Defiant Dreams, The Journey of an Afghan Girl Who Risked Everything for Education. Well, Sola and Malaina, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having us.
So we're going to be talking about your new book, Defiant Dreams, The Journey of an Afghan Girl Who Risked Everything for Education. So first, I think we should meet that Afghan girl. Thank you for being here. Do you mind telling me a little bit about yourself?
So I grew up in Afghanistan, and at age 11, I was forced to stop going to school. And from that day on, the restriction of my life only continued to increase. And Defiant Dream is the story of how I escaped that life and come to the US and study.
Yeah. And so I'm curious, Malaina, how did you get involved in the project?
Sure. So Sola and I first met about 3 years ago. We were actually introduced in the middle of COVID, so we were only able to talk over Zoom. And, immediately I think the first thing that drew me to Sola was just her incredible, inspiring story. The fact that when she was 16 years old, she couldn't even add or subtract, and she barely was able to speak English or even read and write in her native language of Pashto. And from that, being forced to stay within the home, she was able to secretly educate herself. She had this extremely slow dial-up internet connection, and that's what connected her to the outside world and allowed her to start with fractions and addition and subtraction, and then just in the space of 3 years, get to the point where she was studying college level calculus and physics and reading philosophy. So on the face of it, it's just this incredible, inspiring story. And I really wanted to help, be a part of sharing it. And I think on a more personal level, for me, growing up Indian American, there was a lot that I could relate to in Sola's story, not obviously the incredible restrictions she faced growing up in Afghanistan. That's so unique to the place where she was. But generally, in terms of the treatment of women, in terms of food and family and culture, there's so many similarities between the two places that our families come from. And so I think we really had this unspoken understanding from the beginning that then allowed us to work on this book project where Sola would tell me stories from her life and I would write them down. And we kind of built this book that's now out in the world. And really through that process, when we were finally able to meet in person, we went from being just co-authors who had met over Zoom to being like sisters now.
So I'm curious how, obviously, we're going to get back into the memoir, into the story, Sola, of your life and of your journey. But I'm curious, kind of fast forwarding a little bit, who first kind of floated the idea of writing this book? Was it something that you wanted to get off your chest? Or Malaina, did you recommend it? And Sola, you kind of came around to the idea? How did you get there?
So, I back when I was in Afghanistan, I was reading a lot of books, and then I came to the US. And then for me, I began to realize how the story of Afghanistan is seen mostly through journalistic views. And these are, it's shown in extreme situations.
Yeah.
A bomb explodes and 100 people dies. There is no way for you to, empathize with the people. And so for my story, but the thing is, my story is not just about me. It's about like Afghanistan's over 4 decades, and it's so much complex. It's not always, bomb exploding. There was like, we came to this point. It wasn't like that. And so I wanted to create the space for people to enter and both see the extreme situation, but also like the small things that makes us human, and then allow other people to, understand us. So that was basically what drew me to tell this story.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I would add, growing up in the United States, I think we see something very similar. And my perception was always that our understanding of Afghanistan here is very fragmented, right? We have this understanding maybe of Afghanistan in the context of the Cold War, Afghanistan in the context of 2001, and maybe we see, occasional news articles talking about current events. But what we lack is that fuller picture of the country that's colored by those individual stories like Sola's and her family and the people she grew up around. And now, there are so many stories in the book that are deeply personal to Sola, but that also speak to the broader experience of what women and girls especially are going through in Afghanistan today. Like, there's stories in the book about mothers, Sola's mother watching as her daughter went to school for the last time. And that's a story that's now unfolding for thousands, even millions of mothers in Afghanistan. There's stories of all the incredible obstacles Sola had to overcome, which I'm sure we're going to get into, just to make it to the United States. And now we can imagine those being multiplied again across the experiences of so many other girls. And so it just felt also like a really important time to share this story and to really raise awareness about this important issue.
And I think one thing that strikes me the most, and it's something that I want to keep in mind during this conversation that we have, is the intersectionality of each of us, as human beings living on this planet, that we are unique and we are individual entities, and we are also a part of our culture and our gender and our religion or lack thereof, and our socioeconomic status and our geopolitical status. And so, Sola, when I think about your specific story, and again, the representation of so many women who now are struggling, or, we see kind of these recapitulations, I'm struck by what it means to be not just, from Afghanistan, not just a woman, not just culturally Muslim, not just religious. Like, I'm really curious as we go through this conversation about your perspective, because you're right. So often in the West, our understanding of what's going on in Afghanistan is frontline documentaries. And that's not to belittle that, because it's like my favorite show on television. And I think it's really important that we at least are connected to societies that are very easy in the West to ignore. But I'm seeing it through a journalistic gaze, and very often I'm seeing it through a patriarchal gaze. I'm not seeing it from the perspective of women. And I think there's a lot of assumptions that are made about what women want, what women need, what their perspective is, because we sadly aren't hearing it. So let's go back a little bit. Let's talk. You were born in 1996.
Yes.
And so at the time that you were born in Kandahar, did you stay in Kandahar your whole upbringing?
Yes. So I stayed there. And then, so in 2001, when the invasion happened, we briefly went to Pakistan, and then we returned back. And, we saw this initial, obviously, I was young, and then this initial freedom. And then that's when we also enrolled in school, and, the schools for girls were open. And, my mom was, before the civil war happened in the 90s, and then the Taliban took over, she was a professor at Kabul University. And so she was so happy that, this generation of her kids are going to be able to go to school. Like, at the time of the Taliban, one of her worst, that was one of the, she was like, how, she was educated, but her kids were growing up uneducated. So that was something that was in her mind, day and night. But then for us girls, that was stopped when I was 11. And again, my mom like would say like, do you know how it feels to be, to see your kids grow uneducated, for an educated mother, especially because, like you see much, much bigger. And so to see that the world that your kids are growing up is shrinked. And then, that's, for me, initially, I did not know how it feels, like how I was too young to understand what that meant. But then, by the time I was 14, I realized that life was so restricting, and there was like the social world stopped making sense to me. The political world outside was in turmoil. There was suicide bombing exploding, and the fighting between the government side and, the Taliban were increasing. And for me, just like everything stopped making sense. My brothers were going to school. I was not able to go to school. And this every day repeated like the same thing. You just wake up, you watch TV, or you just do chores, and that was it. And so for me, I was like, what is the meaning of life? What is this thing? And that's but I was lucky. I had a grandfather who was self-taught, and he had this extreme importance on learning and specifically on English. And so he said, like, if you know English, it's like opening a window to the world. And I really that really spoke to me very intimately, those words. And I started teaching myself English, and I did not know anything. Like I would watch for hours CNN and BBC, and then I would just like understand a word or two. Or if I was reading something, I would read, and then in one sentence, I had to translate hundreds of words because I would not know the meaning of one word. And that would lead to like this whole page of unknown words to me. And so, but the thing was just being able to do that, because again, like I was living in this patriarchal society where there was this assumption that women are stupid, or like one of the reasons why they're so oppressed because of, something is wrong with them. And so for me, when I began to be able to understand it, I was like, oh, wait, I'm able to do that. So even though it was hard, it was, I was like, it was, and I continued doing it. Mm-hmm. And also, like, I was dependent on everything in my life, on other people. And so to be able to do this thing by myself, it felt really liberating. I just felt like I was building something for myself. And then from like English, I went to study math, and that kind of opened up a whole new other world. And again, it was hard. Like I had to, the internet was really, really slow, and to download every video, you have to wait for hours. But just being able to do that, it was enough to continue.
I think about sort of the timestamps, the benchmarks in time to help get a little bit of an orientation to your life. I'm curious just on a few things. How much older than you is your mother?
So,
like, how old was she when she had you?
I think she was 35.
Okay. So your mom had already been around through, like, I'm just curious, her upbringing was, like you mentioned, she was so educated as to be a professor. So there was a certain amount of openness to the world and openness to possibility. And so she actually saw the world shrinking, and she saw those options and those rights being taken, not just from her daughters, but from herself. So by the time you were born, was she working?
No. So, I was born in 1996. By that time, the Taliban took over. So like the whole world to women was closed. The only thing they could live was inside their house.
I think that the story of Sola's mother is one of the most poignant stories in the book. And it speaks to that idea that, in Afghanistan, history is really moving backwards. When her mother was first born, it was, her father raised her to accept these freedoms, to try and embrace whatever freedom she had, to go to school. He never even let her learn how to cook because he wanted her to be in the classroom and in the world. And from that, when the Soviet invasion happened, and then the civil wars eventually started. She slowly saw herself losing all these freedoms. And then, of course, through Sola's own story, watched as her daughter lost those freedoms too. There's one story in the book about the first time that Sola's oldest brother saw his mother in a burqa. And this was around the time of the Civil War, when this culture of conservatism was really taking over Kandahar. And the burqa is this tent-like restrictive garment. It's the most restrictive garment in the world for women to wear. You can't see any part of the woman's body, and there's just these small crisscross slats over her eyes. And so Sola's brother actually thought that his mother had gone blind, and he used to hold her hand and say, here's the step, here's the street, because he thought she couldn't see. And at that time, he would get laughed at, like, look at this kid, he doesn't understand. She can see through those slats at least a little bit. But I think, of course, if you reflect on it now, his innocent assessment was generally correct, that she had lost her freedom, her ability to move without having her small son, look out for her every step. She had lost so much, and it really was like she had gone blind.
I think about the juxtaposition as well of mom having the awareness and then it being taken from her. And then the sort of antithesis of that, which was that, Sola, you were born into this and it's all you knew for the first several years of your life. And then you got to see an opening. And then, of course, very sadly, you saw it being closed once again. And so I'm curious, obviously, it's not the same as the Afghanistan that your mother grew up in, but I'm curious what that transition was like for you, from only knowing the inside of your home and only knowing being able to go out fully covered, only knowing being able to be in society accompanied and sort of not being free, to slowly having some of those freedoms and those rights available to you.
So, you were talking about like in 2001.
Like when you were like little.
Yeah. I remember when I was a kid, of course, but for me, we would go to Pakistan and I would see that, we were able to go to parks, and even like I would see my mother mostly there. She would, doesn't have to wear this burqa, and then I can see the confidence. And then we would come back to Afghanistan. That was completely different. And then when 2001, when the US invasion happened, I think it's also like at that time for me, freedom, obviously not everything. Kandahar especially was not free.
No, it was
free. Yeah,
right.
It was still very, very restricting. Mm-hmm. And so those small things like, like watching TV, to be able to watch TV, or there was like amusement park, or like some kind of like, or also maybe there was also like this mentally we felt a little free because we were kind of part of the world. Before this, Afghanistan was this pariah state, and it was close. Like even if you go to the shoppings, like the shops, there were not a lot of materials available. The clothes, and then suddenly when it's kind of open to the world, and so for me at that time, like freedoms were mostly in the small things, and or be able to initially go to school, but obviously that also closed, and I was not able to go to school.
How long was that period of time from when you were able to start going, which it sounds like would have been around the age that if the society had always been open, you would have started. It's like the same age that your brothers probably would have gone to school. So you were about what, 5 years old, 6 years old?
Yeah, 6.
6. And then how long were you able to go until that was taken from you?
5 years. So when I was 11, I stopped going to school.
And in 5 years of education is an entire world to somebody who doesn't have any, but 5 years of education is also severely lacking when it comes to the requirements to exist in formal education. And so it's, I'm just really curious if you could tell us a little bit about what that felt like to sort of leave the cage, to get that taste of those little things and then slowly see them disappearing yet again.
So, I think at that time when you're too young, education doesn't, like, for me, I only began to understand what education meant to me when I was 14. At that time, I was too young to understand and my school was not, it was, again, Afghanistan came out of the civil war and then the Taliban time. The school, the teachers, most of the educated people have left the country. And so the teachers were like, like part-time, they had job other places, and they didn't take the teaching very seriously. And I actually did not like going to school or learning there. And that's one of the reasons I was not, by the time I was 14, I was not able to like add and subtract and do any of those maths because, the school wasn't a place that was like intellectually stimulating.
Right. Well, and also there is this thing, that I can only imagine from a psychological perspective, that just because another force comes in and overturns a force, that there's a geopolitical change and the rule of law changes, doesn't mean that that culture has changed, and it doesn't mean that views have changed. There's still probably quite a lot of sexism and quite a lot of pressure for the individuals who were holding power to continue to assert that power. So even if a freedom is opened up overnight, the hearts and minds aren't really changing overnight.
I mean, I think it takes society time because you go to such extremes. And coming back, I think to have a normal society, I think it takes time to evolve back.
Mm. And I think sometimes our perception in the US of what Afghanistan looks like at a given moment is maybe looking at a big city like Kabul with a lot of Western influence. But something that I really learned through the process of writing this book is that Kandahar, where Sola grew up, was always incredibly conservative. It was a stronghold of the Taliban back in the late 90s, and it's a stronghold for them now. And so, of course, as you mentioned, the culture, no matter who was in charge, was incredibly conservative. And in the book, we write about the fact that Sola, as a 5 or 6 year old child, seeing the U.S. come in and seeing small changes like TVs now being allowed or photographs now being allowed or schools being open. Initially, she saw that as freedom, but when she looked further, she realized her sisters were still forced to wear burqas. Her mother was still forced to wear a burqa. There was still this overwhelming, pressure on women. It hadn't lifted as significantly as other things had, like trade or communication. And it wasn't the Taliban that was in power when Sola was forced to stop going to school, but it was really just this culture of those sympathizers that made it dangerous for her to keep going. When she was 11, a group of men came to her father's door and they basically threatened to throw acid in her face or to do something worse if she ever, if that family ever sent their daughters back to school. And so I think that really speaks to just how dangerous it was for girls and women, even in the early 2000s in Kandahar.
And how that must influence your own self-perception and your own self-worth and your own views about what's right and wrong. And I think that's a really complicated question that I would love to grapple with a little bit, because it's very easy for me, somebody who's born in the West, who grew up in the West, and who has always had the privileges as a woman of being an outspoken feminist and talking about social justice in very, let's say, uncertain terms. And that's not to say that women in the West don't have struggles either, because the patriarchy is far and deep reaching, but we also have quite a lot of privilege. And I think that there's often a very human mentality, which is quite binary. Either you're conservative or you're progressive. Either you believe that women should have ultimate and, absolute freedom and equality and egalitarianism, and you're like kind of a hardcore outspoken feminist, or you believe in, the constructs that we've kind of been discussing. But I think that most people net out in a complex place. And so, my personal views are neither here nor there, but I'm really curious, Sola, about your perspective on let's pick a symbol like the burqa and compare it maybe to another symbol like the hijab. And notice the differences between what these things represent and how women can make meaning out of these experiences. Because I think very often we're not listening to the women themselves and what their own perspective is. So I'd love to hear your views on, obviously we're not just talking about an article of clothing. We're talking about a representation of a viewpoint. And so I'm curious maybe what you thought then, what you think now, and how you feel about, let's say, the burqa versus the hijab.
So I think for me, whenever I wore burqa, it felt like, you're kind of divorced from the world. You are just, no one sees your face. Especially the Afghan burqa, which I have personal experience with that. Even I think the way you're walking, you're just like, your heads are kind of down. And so I think it just strips you away from your personality. And immediately when you step into the world, you feel like, okay, my place is in this faceless, like kind of like an object thing. But of course, but then you can't, we can't just, in Afghanistan, for example, women are forced to wear that. But in hijab, I think, again, I think it's in the West, if, my sisters are wearing hijab. And one of my sister, I grew up with her. And at home, I didn't, inside the house, I wouldn't wear a hijab, but she would wear a hijab because that's what she liked. So I think it comes to choice and also the differences.
I think about sort of, again, I'm coming from the perspective of a Western woman who is an atheist, right? So I don't have a belief structure. I was raised religious, but I left my religion and I, don't believe in God and I don't ascribe to any particular religions. And culturally, I don't know what American culture really is, but I don't have a deep connection to any intense kind of cultural identity. And I have friends, right? I have friends who wear hijab, and I have friends who are, let's say, culturally Jewish, but religiously secular. And, I think that there's this complicated experience that we can have as individuals with our faith and with our cultural identity, where we can choose what aspects of those things have meaning for us and represent them personally. And we're lucky enough in the West to be able to leave behind the ones that we don't. But what I'm hearing from you is that when you were growing up, and especially how things are now, there was no choice. It's you do it the way that you're told to do it, because as a woman, you don't have that voice.
Yeah, exactly.
And so
in many respects, at some level, when you're talking about a government like the Taliban, you're not even really talking about religion anymore. It just becomes an excuse for all of these incredible oppressions of human rights. The fact that just this month, the Taliban banned beauty salons in Afghanistan. And that was, there was some kind of religious justification behind that they came up with. But really, it was a way to stop women from having access to the last ways that they had to make money and support their families. It was beauty salons were one of the last places that women had to gather freely. And now there really are no public places where women can go out. And on a more philosophical level, when your job and your education is taken from you, even basically the way you look becomes one of your last markers of individuality. And even that was taken away. And so it really, it goes beyond any kind of religious component, I think. And it's important to look at what's happening in Afghanistan today and what happened throughout Sola's childhood, really, I think, from a standpoint of what human rights are being violated, regardless of the justification.
And yeah, I love the fact that you not only made that distinction, but that you use that term justification, because I think one of the biggest failures of progressive causes in the West and this is something I grapple with a lot within academic circles, right? Because I'm working in a psychology setting, is these different concepts, and we can call them academic concepts of cultural relativism versus cultural absolutism versus cultural contextualism, whatever. Like those labels are kind of neither here nor there. I view myself as somebody who's a cultural contextualist. There are certain things that culturally are congruent that I may not understand and that my viewpoints may not apply because I wasn't raised with that frame. But I also think that there are hard and fast human rights lines in the sand, and there are violations. And I think sometimes what we struggle with in the West is that in an effort to be culturally sensitive, we forget that. And we actually end up turning a blind eye to massive human rights violations because they are ostensibly part of the religion or part of the culture, or there's some sort of justification there by the powers that be, because we're not listening to the people who are oppressed because they don't have a voice that's been taken from them. So we're allowing the oppressors to write that narrative. And I think that's deeply dangerous. And we've done that many, many times in the West, where we're like, well, I'm not really allowed to have a perspective on this because I don't know what it's like there. And it's like, no, but we should be listening to the people who are struggling.
Yeah, I think that can be part of it. I think also something that Sola and I have found in the last month, kind of sharing this story, though, is that we have so much hope for what awareness can do. And that sometimes it's just that these stories aren't being shared broadly, especially in the West. You know, when the Taliban took over Afghanistan in 2021, there was all of this talk about a Taliban 2.0, a Taliban that was going to somehow join the international order, somehow protect at least basic women's rights, that wanted to have an economy. And that was the story of the Taliban that stayed in the news for as long as Afghanistan stayed in the news. And then, the cycle shifted and people were talking about different things. And it's at that point that the Taliban then began this steady erosion of women's rights. The fact that women weren't allowed in public places, in schools, and workplaces, something that's continued for 2 years, to the fact that just this week, the Taliban is starting to restrict girls in the 3rd grade and older from attending school, when before it was the 6th grade and older. And so it's really also just about getting people to hear about these stories and turning the world's attention, because, once you read something like that or hear something like that, I think it is hard to turn away.
Well, and I think, Sola, that's why what you are doing right now is so deeply important, because there's this, I guess, negative, I don't know what the right word is. It's like the irony, the negative feedback loop, it's the intentionality of a closed system and a structure of oppression that the oppressed their voice is taken from them, right? So part of the reason that we don't hear these stories is because our heads are in the sand. But part of the reason is because the people whose stories we need to hear most are the people whose voices are the most silenced. And so you, in pursuing it through just unimaginable odds, what you have pursued, and in gaining not just the knowledge that you need, the wisdom, the insight, all of that, but the channels to do it, are now able to freely share your story. But that took not just a lot of bravery, it took a lot of know-how. And sadly, when individual voices are oppressed, part of the system of keeping them quiet is preventing, as we talked about, it's preventing them from literacy. It's preventing them from even necessarily having the tools to know that anything is wrong.
Yeah, I mean, I think for example, like a Taliban, it's an authoritarian regime, and they have silenced media and any other voice, so that their voices become, like, their lies becomes the only truth. Or even, like, we talk about education being banned from women, but it's not just even for men, like even for young boys, the education that they're getting, it's all like they're getting it more and more focused on, extremist ideologies. So I think it's important, like, when, as you said, when we say, it's a culture, I think it's important to understand the history of Afghanistan. Like, extremism wasn't part of Afghanistan. It's, when, in the early 1960s, Afghanistan was progressive, and, it was, women were allowed to go to school, and it's not just they were allowed to go to school, but the two part of Afghanistan, the modern and the conservative, was living like in a very easy, like there were not a lot of conflict. If you talk, like if you watch like movies from that time, or like documentary or pictures, you can see a veiled woman with a like next to a woman wearing a skirt, and so it's really the politics that kind of put those two in extreme, like the conservative and the to be like in fight with one another. And so I think that really reveals that it's not a culture. It's like the politics that get into the way, and it can be different if we take the time to understand. And so like even so and for example, for me in Afghanistan, it's not just when I was trying to get out of Afghanistan, it's not just the system in Afghanistan that's against me, but it's also the US. And when I was trying to get a visa, I was able to get educated, to self-educate, and then go to Pakistan to take the SAT, and then come back and accepted to universities. And then when I was went to the embassy, that person, like the officer, just in 1 minute refused my visa and said, well, I don't think you're going to study in America. You're just going there to immigrate. So I think those perception needs also to shatter.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it also goes to show that we might see more extreme or less extreme versions of the patriarchy across the globe, but that structure is still very much in power. And that structure, as you mentioned, and I just really think it bears repeating, is not a natural order. It's not that if, there was a nuclear war and we all started back from ground zero, that we would build up the exact same culture over and over again, because this is how human beings were built. These are intentional structures that were built to perpetuate power. And when there are intentional structures that are intentionally built to perpetuate power, some people have it and some people don't. And we can see really extreme examples of that and less extreme examples of that. And unfortunately, I mean, my heart breaks as I sit here and speak to you about this, because your story is a beautiful story of hope, but it's also got devastating parts in it that show exactly what happens when people who are built the same, you and I, we are not different from a genetic anatomical perspective. We just happen to be born in two different places.
Yeah, I think for me that's very, it's like how, I think this is like still I try to understand it, when we achieve something, like how much it is that, it's like, this, now that I think about it, it's like this 11-year-old Sola is again in Afghanistan, and she is stuck. And most of the time I think about it is, when I achieve something, or I just, instead of being happy, I feel sad, because it says that like I can't be just the only one who can do those things. There's so many other people. There's so many girls in Afghanistan that can do more than me, but yet they are not, and they will never know that they can do. And I think that's even more devastating.
Yeah, I think that point that you make, it's something I was sort of, I think, clumsily trying to point to earlier, is this idea that it's not a bug of the system. It's a feature that individual girls and women develop internalized misogyny, and that they themselves start to feel like they don't have the capability to gain knowledge, and that their actual station in life is to care for their, fathers or brothers or partners or whatever that may be, and that their lives are literally worth less than the lives of men. And that comes to be an intrinsic belief system even among the women. And I think that's a hard thing for a lot of men to understand when they look at this from the outside, or even women who live in more open societies. Like, how could you possibly think that about yourself? It's like, well, that's what gaslighting and brainwashing does to people.
Yeah. I mean, for me, it took me I mean, even when I come to because as you said, it's hard because, it's like you live in this, a room, and that's in the, that's what is right. And then stepping out of that, and even when you step out, it's hard because it's just, you have two, then you develop these two parts of, like, for me, when I start learning, and then whenever I got stuck, I would feel like, oh, maybe, or like I would study and then I would get headache. And then I would feel like, oh, maybe, because that's what was this understanding, like, woman brain is small, and if she studies a lot, then she's going to damage her brain. And so for a long time I would be like, oh, maybe it's because of that. And then again, until very recently, like, I tried to understand the patriarchal structure, like why our society, as like not just in Afghanistan but globally, why is it the way it does that really mean that, like, women are somehow less than men? So only when I really, like, study, like, anthropological books to really study the evolution of, like, society, how societies were built, then, like, only then I was able to completely free my mind from the grip of patriarchy. And, like, it took me, I don't know, 12 or 13 years of, like, studying, thinking to get over it.
And you're probably not fully over it even now. I mean, I know I'm not, and I had nowhere near the oppressive upbringing that you had. Like, I still find myself internalizing messages and making excuses and falling into old patterns. And I have to constantly remind myself that this is not just, this isn't me talking. This is what I've been taught. This is me having some sort of programmatic reaction to everything that I've known growing up. So I can imagine that, like, it takes so much mental effort. Obviously there is an after and a before, right? Like, you can't really put the genie back in the bottle. And then the amount of insight that you have and the amount of understanding that you have now is like, you can't shut your eyes back to it. But there are probably still things that creep up that continue to surprise you.
Yeah, I think that's something that came up for us while we were writing the book, because like you said, I was born in the United States, and there are things that were very shocking to me that Sola would tell me about her life almost matter of fact, because they had been such fundamental parts of her growing up that even at that point, 1 or 2 years ago, she hadn't even fully questioned them. Ideas about when girls get married, of course, I knew about arranged marriage, and I knew that was something that happened in Afghanistan. But to hear the fact that, in Kandahar, girls are married by 16, and it's a scandal if your daughter isn't married by 16. And of course, they're married to much older men. And so, there were so many things like that. And I think also to your previous point about the kind of how one can internalize the idea that women are somehow less than men. I think also what reinforces that is just the incredible physical and infrastructure barriers. If you look at Afghanistan, for example, that women face just to getting out, and how could you come up against those barriers again and again and not start to believe that, maybe it's something with me, not that this whole society or governmental structure is somehow engineered against women. Like, I think,
because it almost seems ludicrous that there would be that big of a conspiracy, but there is. It's like being born with your hands tied behind your back, and you never could look at the ties, and you couldn't feel them with your own hands. And then one day recognizing, if I undid these ties, I could use my hands, but you didn't even see those as ties. That's just how your hands were.
Yeah. And I think a good example of this is actually the story of how Sola had to prove her education in order to apply to U.S. colleges. So at this point, she had been studying. She knew that her ultimate goal was to get to the United States and continue her education, but she didn't have the actual proof of what level she was at because she hadn't gone to a real school. And so first she tried to go to the Kandahar Ministry of Education to get some kind of certification, but the officials there wouldn't even look her in the eyes because she was a woman, let alone give her the proper paperwork. And then she tried to take the GED, the American GED, but that wasn't even offered anywhere in Afghanistan or any neighboring countries. And so the SAT became her only way out. And it wasn't even offered in Afghanistan. It was only in Pakistan. So Sola had to cross one of the most dangerous borders in the world, a border where it's common for people to be beaten with electric cables, a border where men and women are separated and where you have to take multiple vehicles just to get across. She made it to Pakistan. She got the last spot in a test administration in Karachi. From, after going through all that, she somehow managed to score high enough to apply to colleges in the United States. And it was only after going through all that she even had the right papers and the right information to even start thinking about getting out.
And that's like mostly self-education at that point too. I think that's something that it just bears repeating here in the US for individuals who have taken the SAT, and especially for those who have been in a privileged enough position that they went through either pretty good public or private schools and still then took extra test prep courses and got additional tutoring to try and do well enough on this test to be able to get into college, that you were doing all of this yourself. You were so set up for failure.
I mean, the thing for me, getting out, for me, I knew what life was if I didn't do this. So, I just, again, I went back to one of my grandfather. He said, well, if you want to do something, you'll find a way. If you don't want to do, you're going to find excuses. And for me, I think excuses were everywhere, but I just wanted to be the one who find a path. And I think it just there was so much that I wanted to know. There was this darkness around me, and I wanted to find that light, and however hard that was. And by that point, I think learning and getting education became the meaning of my life. And I just said, if I don't stand for this thing, then what will I be able to stand for? And then I think my spirit will be crushed. And I just felt it if I don't do this, I don't think I will be able to live.
And the kinds of things she had to go through too, the fact that she couldn't study during the day because as a woman in her household, she was required to cook and clean the entire day. So instead, she would study in the middle of the night or the very early hours of the morning using this extremely slow dial-up internet connection to download math and science videos one at a time. It's incredible to think about. I remember there's one quote that she told me that she hung above her desk at that time, which we write about in the book. And it's a quote from a Bollywood movie. And the translation is, I want to fly. I want to run. I'm not even afraid of falling down. I just don't want to stop.
Sola, I'm curious about how your journey has mapped onto or has affected the people in your life that you love, thinking about your siblings and thinking about just your nuclear family, and where is everybody now, and what is, do you have a relationship with these individuals?
Yeah, of course. So my family is mostly outside of Afghanistan. And so I think in the book, I have the story of my nephew. And with him, I share a very, very close bond because, he was born when I was 13. And then in some sense, I started learning as he was learning. So we have we started this journey in some sense together. And one thing that I wanted for him was that I didn't want him to be like everyone. And so, as we talk about a lot about patriarchy, and so if we tell young boys from the very beginning that this is wrong and that's how it should be, then they pick it up that as the right way to do it. And so I saw, now he's 16 years old, and we talk everything. Luckily, he's now in Canada, and, we talk about the system and, what he tells me, he's as frustrated as me when he looks back to women are not going to school in Afghanistan. And I mean, I think in some sense, him, it does give me hope that things can change if we, start working toward it. And if we just say it like, okay, this is how it is. And, that's again, like, this is patriarchy. And as long as there are men, this is going to continue, which I don't think is true.
Right. It's almost like there's this, you need to have an interest in pulling the wool out from over your eyes. And once you can do that and you can see it and you have that insight, then you can develop the action. But it's very, very hard to do anything about it if you don't even recognize that it's a problem.
Yeah, I really like this, the Plato's Cave, which I've listened to it, read it so many times, which I think really does, if you see things as a shadow, you will believe this is a shadow. And again, but only when you go look at the light outside, then you understand, okay, what I was seeing was shadows. But again, I think with adults, I think it's hard to teach them. But I think we have a lot of hopes for the younger generation, the way they are growing up. We can give them the right tools to understand the world. And then I think that will make the world better.
Yeah, I agree. I'm curious. There's one kind of more point. Obviously, there's a million things we could talk about. And in just a second, I want to ask you about anything that you think is important to discuss that we haven't yet. But there's one more point, and I think it's probably a very difficult one, but it's one that I would love to explore with you, Sola. And I'd also be interested in your take on this, Malaina. There is this paradox that occurs wherein to effect change, sometimes we have to leave the very place where the change is so oppressive because we are the oppressed and we don't have enough power within the system to actually, speak up about the system. You, against all odds, left. You educated yourself and then you continued your education. And now you're living in the West. You're publishing this book. You're speaking out loud about this so that all can hear. But there is also that risk and that fear now that the Taliban has, seized control once again, that message may not be getting back to the very people who were you that many years ago. And I'm curious about that complicated feeling of being a person who left in order to have a voice that then would maybe not resonate back in the same place that you left from.
Yeah, I think this one quote is from my favorite author, and it says that, where my voice is important, I can't speak there, but at the place where I can speak, there's no one to listen. So I think I do feel that way. And I do feel like, yes, I don't think my story is going to reach to another 11-year-old Sola. But I think sharing the story is the first step to bring awareness. And I hope that eventually will lead to some change so that, another young person like me can, use that, we can hopefully build tools so that more people can use or create a path that makes it easier for people, even though there's obstacles, so that they can use it and be educated. And so despite the system.
Yeah. Yeah, like almost that your voice may reach somebody else who reaches somebody else who reaches somebody else who eventually reaches an 11-year-old Sola. And it may be that is how this reverberation has to happen. Or it may be that, maybe 11-year-old Sola doesn't pick up this book, but she does 30 years down the line, and that's the power, I think, of a literary voice. And it's the power of print. And it's the power of storytelling, is that it will affect people right now, but it will affect people years in the future as well. And there's no expiration date on that. And I think that's what makes it even more powerful.
I hope so.
Yeah, I think it's hard to think about, there is, even though this is such an inspiring story, there is a sadness in it because it is so exceptional, and it's not something that we see often in the United States or anywhere in the West, that, a girl or a woman being able to make it out in this way. And so I think really our goal with this book was to reject the idea that we often see that Sola mentioned in the West of what Afghans, Afghanistan, and Afghan women are, that idea of passivity, that idea of victimhood. And a real message we wanted to send by telling Sola's story, but also the story of her parents and her nieces and nephews and her siblings, is that, you know, her story was a story of rebellion that led to a way out. She managed to find education. She managed to find the right tests and the right visa applications and a pathway out. But there are so many rebellions that are taking place every day in Afghanistan, you know, in kitchens, with children, through women who are trying to get money or some kind of independence from their husbands, even if that only buys them a day or a month of freedom. And so what our primary goal was is to say, you know, there are so many people fighting within Afghanistan right now. And now is a chance for us in the West to think about our responsibility in this fight.
Oh, I so agree. And I think about, you know, the point that you guys made so beautifully and so saliently, that this is not the natural order of things. And it's not always been this way. And your own mother is such a shining example of a woman that other women or young girls can look to and be like, wait, how is it that she has this voice? How is it that she has this education? You know, that these things that seem like insurmountable, they're only several years old. It's one thing to talk about affecting glacial change when a culture or a society has had certain norms for hundreds and hundreds of years. It's another thing when we're seeing these massive changes sometimes almost overnight. And yes, we did talk about how perspectives take longer to change. Societal norms might take longer to change. But the rule of law, the authoritarian regime here, was swift. It was swift and it was brutal. And it wasn't like that yesterday, and it doesn't have to be like that tomorrow. But we have to care enough. I think we in the West have to care enough. And I'm speaking for we, the royal we, not you, but we, the people listening to the show. And our eyes have to remain open.
Yeah, I think it's also, as you said, it's important to understand history. I think that's allow us to, you know, to see a present in a more bigger picture. And for me, that most of the time it does give me hope, to, like, for example, as I said, like, patriarchy is, again, like, that's not from the very beginning how our world started. So I think, yeah, and understanding the history of the world will allow us to create a better future.
There's so much hope in this young generation in Afghanistan. The fact that many people did have access to education in places that were less conservative than Kandahar, places like Kabul. And even in the book, we track the kind of awakening of Sola and her siblings when they started to have access to the internet and realize that the world was not Afghanistan, that there were places outside with more prosperity and freedom. And so there's a generation armed with that knowledge. And I think that also lends a lot of hope to the story of what Afghanistan's future might look like.
100%. You know, I can't help but think of that very kind of classic MLK speech from 1968 when he said that, like, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. There are times when we go backward before we go forward again. But when we take a broader look, because of that view of history, because of that educated understanding, we do see that change can occur for the better. It's really hard to see it sometimes when we're only looking, you know, right in front of our face. But the power of studying history, the power of education, and the power of connecting globally to people who are different from ourselves, who have different views and perspectives is so deeply important. So I guess that leads me to the question, Sola, you know, what is it? What do you study? What do you want to study? Where do you see yourself continuing in this journey?
So I'm currently at Tufts University, developing quantum algorithms to simulate problems in quantum chemistry. But at the same time, I'm focusing a lot on, you know, writing and, I really feel like Afghanistan hasn't been explored creatively. And I think that does take away a lot of, from people in the West to understand it. And also like back for the Afghans, like it doesn't, when you, for example, like I read Egyptian, like Cairo trilogy, I think it kind of gives you back the history, and it just, so I think I feel like that's not really done for Afghanistan. And so I think that's, continuing with both writing and research.
I love that. And just kind of showing the world a side of this, these people, this culture, this rich history that has been very much colored by the geopolitical and like by the way that it's represented journalistically in the West, is obviously a big goal, but one that I think, because it's so underexplored, as you mentioned, it's one that can affect a lot of change. There's a lot of potential there. And I think that that's just beautiful. I'm curious, Malaina, what are your goals? Where, what are you studying and looking forward to continuing with?
I'm a rising junior right now at Stanford. And so I guess what's immediately next is finishing my undergraduate career. But, this project is something that I started before college, and I think it's really shaped my understanding of what I want to study. It's shaped my understanding of women's rights and global women's rights. And I think that there's a lot you can understand by reading a textbook or or an article in the newspaper, but it's so much more impactful when you start to hear those personal stories like I've heard from Sola over the past few years, and then, getting to know her more personally and getting to understand the stories of her family and others in, similar situations to her. So I think my hope is to move forward with that knowledge and to think about, from an American perspective, how can I be a part of the solution and the fight for global women's rights?
And I'm curious here, sort of on the eve, like this is going to be airing. I know we're time traveling a little bit because you have to do that when you podcast, but this is going to be airing on August 14th. So just the eve of the, I guess you call it the anniversary of the Taliban takeover. I'm curious from maybe both of you, I'd love to hear what is it that you hope those who are listening to this show right now would do to maybe educate themselves, to become more aware, to engage in a way that maybe they've been resistant to doing in the past?
I can start.
Sure.
I think it just comes down to the fact that we have to remember these dates, and we have to remember these anniversaries, and we have to look, seek out stories from people, understand what's happening now, how have things changed in the past year. The fact that I mentioned earlier that just this week we saw another huge reduction in the number of girls who are now legally allowed to attend school in Afghanistan. The situation is changing. It's changing rapidly, but I think that there sometimes is a tendency in the US to think of Afghanistan as this affair or something that's happened that's stretching on forever. And whether it's been 1 year since the Taliban takeover or whether it's been 5 years, it's just a sad situation that maybe hasn't changed and won't change, and is easier to just push out of sight and out of mind. And so more than anything specific, I think it's just about taking the time to mark that anniversary, think about what it means for the girls and women in Afghanistan, and really engage with their stories.
Yeah. Sola, do you have anything that you want to add to that? Or is there even anything else that we haven't covered that you feel like is important to be said here as we're kind of nearing the end of the conversation?
I think for me, it's not to see it as a normalized, even like the war in Afghanistan, it just for people just felt, okay, like, when something, our attention span, like we pay attention, like maybe like for 3 months or something, and then we just it becomes normalized. But for women in Afghanistan, it's not normalized. Like every day, it's this, you know, every day you feel the pain every day when you're like going from one room to the other, from kitchen, and then there's nothing to do. And then not just for the same person, then the same, another generation. So even though from the outside world, it would seem like, okay, you know, women don't have the rights in Afghanistan. And then, you know, that's how you see it. But I think you just have to feel like, how does it feel to live in that? And then, you know, see like, how does it feel to feel that have that feeling every day.
Yeah. And I mean, I guess the only thing I can add to that is how important your book is for helping people tap in to that empathy and tap into that kind of story. So everybody, I just want you to remember the book is Defiant Dreams, The Journey of an Afghan Girl Who Risked Everything for Education by Sola, Mahfouz, and Malaina Kapoor. Thank you guys so much for spending your time with us today, for opening my eyes, and for sharing this important and I know very difficult, but also very hopeful story.
Thanks for
Thank you so much.
giving us a chance to share this story.
Absolutely. And listen, good luck in your pursuits. I am really looking forward to seeing, you know, your continued journey, to seeing what's next for both of you. And I'm just so grateful for the opportunity to sit down with you today. And of course, everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.